Hello, my name is Martin, and this is my medieval map showcase and asset pack. So I'll be covering the project scope, the process of development, the problems I faced, my final reflection, and the deliverables. So I had to decide if it was high poly, low poly, and if it was enterable. The buildings would be enterable. It would have furniture, props, and interior, etc. I went with a high poly but not enterable house because I had initial plans of making the map fairly large, but I would have had to sacrifice detail in order to do that. And if I just made it low poly and I didn't add any materials to it, I feel like it wouldn't have made my research, it wouldn't have done it justice because I'd researched all these materials, what they used, why they were used, and if I just didn't use them and everything was flat, I feel like that didn't make a lot of sense to me. And so I decided to go with high poly. Now going the other direction, I didn't want the buildings to be enterable because although I did do some research and into the interiors, I didn't want to make it even smaller because due to time constraints, I was still under the same time pressures as everyone else. If I had decided to make the buildings enterable, I would have focused on each building even more and it would have been a lot smaller, and I believe that it wouldn't look big enough to be a believable town. So a sneak peek, well, a full peek at the final outcomes. The process that I started off with was the inspiration from the references on the very right. Um, I wanted to evoke a sense of community, peace and hope, and activity. I wanted the town to be believable, and because townspeople weren't living the best life in the medieval times, I believed hope and peace was a very important thing to think about at the time. It's also portrayed well in anime, particularly about medieval times being a time of social gatherings and community and people talking. And I wanted to evoke the same hustle bustle in my map. And I also sort of wanted to highlight the absence of them. Um, so above it is my overhead plan, um, wildly out of proportion. Um, it was mainly there just so I can place everything in its little place. Um, it was a rough plan. So below it is my Gantt chart. As you can see, it is currently the day before the deadline. So it was mostly due to the buildings taking a lot longer than I had anticipated. But the texturing actually went really quickly, so that evened it out. But I'm still on time for the video presentation. I didn't get down to the Unreal Engine because of some major problems. But yep. So the process that I went through was doing the houses on the top left first. So I started off with a market stand, and then I moved on to the first house on the right of it, which was flat, but it was highly customizable. So bottom left is my second house, which I did after, and I believed it was a lot more visually interesting than the first one due to it having a lot of depth, having a lot of, I believe, character, because there's the tower in the middle, there's the chimney, and the overhangs. I believe it just makes it a lot more interesting than the first one. So I did the tower on the right after. It was a lot less complicated than the houses, um, purely because I wanted to add tileable textures. I was going to add cobblestone to the bottom and planks on the top. So I moved on to the cathedral after on the very left, well, left of the tower. Um, I'd copied the reference from the building on the very back on the top right, AI generated image. It looked really it looked really cool. Sorry, I'm sick. But it was massive, and so I had to do some stretching a bit in order to make it look like it wasn't stretched. Um, I worked on the fountain next, just to break up the sort of rigid blocks for the buildings and structures. And then I worked on the trees on the bottom left, just because it was on my initial plan at the time, as well as the fountain, but it also serves the same purpose of breaking up the sort of blockiness of the structures. So here is my process of placing it down. It sort of followed the arrangements of my plan at the bottom, but there was a lot of tweaks that I had to do. And so let's say it was merely inspired by it, rather it being a carbon copy of the plan at the bottom. So the two main problems that I encountered was actually is something that actually stopped me from uploading it to, well, importing it to Unreal Engine. The reason for that being I used the Node Wrangler add-on and I scaled it in the shading tab. When importing it into Unreal Engine, the scales was not translated when importing, and so as a result all the textures were blown up. And because I had put in quite a bit of textures, it would have just been a massive headache, and I was already aware that Blender has a walk around sort of functionality to it that is basically what I just wanted from Unreal. And so I just felt like it wasn't worth the extra time, and I believe I would have missed the video presentation as well if I had done all of that in the end. And on the right is a massive, massive problem that I had was I wanted to make a tree before calling it final. I realized that there was no nature in there. It looked very plain, it looked very depressing. And so what I did was I tried to make a tree first, and then I looked at branch textures that were PBR. There was no branch textures in the texture website that I used, which was free, and I wasn't feeling like spending money on PBR textures on textures.com. And so I took the leaves individually. It came out packaged as a 3x3 grid, which was super annoying. And so I had to separate that out with the UVs. I had to duplicate the leaf essentially like 9 times, and I had to tweak the UVs so it would only show the PBR of the specific leaf. I unfortunately only used the very top left leaf because it I encountered a lot of problems. Um, Namely, you couldn't just stick leaves. Otherwise, I would have had to model each branch individually. And so what I did was I essentially made my branch texture. And so what I did was I modeled the branch using a plane, just a flat plane, and then using a hair emitter to put the leaves on the branch itself, and then using another hair emitter to put the branches on the tree. And so the final outcome of that was unfortunately 1.79 million triangles per tree, but I believe it wasn't very many trees. 4 trees, just a few, you know, just a few million triangles. It's not too bad. It's not a forest, and it didn't take too much of a hit on my computer. So the things that went well was I was very happy with the visual outcome. I roughly stayed within the scope that I said I was going to do. I didn't make the buildings enterable, but it was a showcase that believably looked like a town. That I believed there would be people walking around doing their daily life, daily business, going to the cathedral, visiting the market outside, looking at the clock tower as if it was functional, and going inside of their homes, doing whatever peasants did at the time, or middle class people at the time. And it was decently optimized, except for the roof tilings and the leaves of the tree, because I really did not want to cut corners with the tiles because it would have looked very obvious that I was cutting corners, because the ends of the tiles, it would have been clear as day that it was, whether it was a actual tile or it was just a texture, a PBR texture. So what didn't go well was the pre-planning. It was terrible. I was busy with other stuff at the time. I was trying to get a job. I was going through my first few shifts on the job. So like basically the first 2 weeks, I made little to no progress. And then on the final 2 weeks, um, I just managed to cobble it all together, and it was mainly time management as well. I feel like if I had planned it out more thoroughly, I would have been able to stay more focused and burn out less. And also wish that I had made more consistent documentation, but I just believe that um, if I just wanted to get into the zone, because if I was posting in between that, it wouldn't have made my mind very happy. Mostly because I wanted my mind to do all of the creation in one period and the documentation in the period after that. Another thing is I couldn't catch up with work fast enough. If I had caught up with work fast enough, I would have made more time to work on the solar project. And that's the end. Thank you for watching my presentation.